this presentation is a kind of my reflection on my activism and my engagement in last 15 years in Indonesia, both as a Muslim activist, Muslim intellectual, and also as I would describe myself beside as a liberal Muslim, as a Muslim Democrat. This is not a scientific analysis of the Indonesian politics, but rather my personal confession or testimony or whatever you call as an Indonesian. The question that I'm dealing with here in my presentation is the question that has been debated and discussed, I think, in America and Europe in post-9/11's era. And that question is about whether Islam is compatible with democracy or not. This question might be boring for some of you, but believe me, in Indonesia, this question is still a burning question that preoccupy many Muslim and many intellectual. Last year, there was an interview in the Jakarta Post with the former leader of Majelis Mujahidin Indonesia, the Indonesian Council of Mujahidin. His name is Abu Bakar Ba'asyir. Some of you might be familiar with him. Abu Bakar was allegedly considered as the spiritual leader or spiritual mentor of Jamaah Islamiyah in Southeast Asia. He was exiled to Malaysia and stayed in Malaysia for many years and had some student in Malaysia and then came back after Reformasi. And last year, he gave a very interesting interview to the Jakarta Post, in which he said that democracy is kafir, is an infidel or an Islamic political system. And he proposed what he called as Allahcracy. The political system based on the sovereignty of God. This statement might sound, funny or kind of joke to some of you, but for some Muslim, even though it's not majority of the Muslim, but for some Muslim, the idea that God is a sovereign, that God is the sole holder of power, and human being is a vicegerent, is Khalifa, as it is said in the Quran. A human being is God's vicegerent on earth, and the responsibility of the human being is not to supplant or to supersede God's sovereignty, but rather to enhance, to enforce what God will for the human being. And the question is, what is God's or divine will? What is divine mind or will for the human being? Of course, the divine will is, in Islamic conception, is represented or is represented in what is called as divine law. That's why the law or Sharia is very, very important. It's occupying a very, very important in the Muslim life and also in the Muslim belief, because it's not only a legal arrangement that governs Muslim life, but also it represents a divine and a true and a transcendent order of things. This how the world should be ordered, and this is the only way of how we should order the world. The rest of system is not valid. The only valid system that is eligible to govern Muslim life is this divine law. That's why the Sharia discourse and controversy is very, very heatedly debated in Muslim society. So that's the question that I'm dealing with in my presentation. um, uh, the title of my presentation is actually inspired by a book authored by Professor Asif Bayat from Iran, who used to be the director of ISIM in Leiden. He authored in 2007 a book entitled Making Islam Democratic. And the question that Asif Bayat was dealing with in the book is that the same question, whether Islam is compatible with democracy or not. But there is something interesting in this book because according to Asif Bayat, this question is phrased rather inappropriate. Because to question whether Islam is compatible with democracy implies that Islam has some kind of trans-historic essence. So this question has a tendency to essentialize Islam, as if Islam is a religion with one monolithic essence where you can pinpoint and then you can say that this is Islam, and that is not. So if you say that Islam is compatible with democracy, that is Islam. Or if somebody says that Islam is not compatible with democracy, that is Islam. So the question is rather inappropriate because it tends to essentialize Islam as a religion. As you may know, that is not the case. I mean, if you observe the debate that's going on in Muslim society, it's very clear that various and different Muslim organizations and groups, individual intellectual scholars, they propose different response to this question. So there is no such thing as Islamic, quote unquote, with regard to this question. So Asif Bayat make a case or make an argument that this question is not a good question. The good question is to look at various effort or attempt made by Muslims to make Islam democratic or not democratic. So the question is not whether Islam compatible with democracy or not, but whether Muslims themselves are capable of mastering resources, either theological, cultural, doctrinal, social, political, whatsoever, mastering these resources to support, to legitimize democracy as a concept. And if we look at Indonesia as an example, for me it's very interesting. I used to be very skeptical about, as a Muslim liberal activist, I used to be very, very skeptical about the role of the Islamic Party in Indonesia. Because, I mean, as a Muslim activist and intellectual, I was raised in a tradition that was started by the late Professor Nurcholish Madjid. Nurcholish Madjid is seen as the icon, as the leaders and the intellectual engine behind the liberal and progressive Islamic movement in Indonesia. And one of the important legacy left behind by Cak Nur, as he's known in Indonesia, is a slogan. This slogan is very important. The slogan runs as follows: Islam yes, Partai Islam not. So Islam is okay, but if you want to exert Islam into political landscape, that's something to be seen with suspicion. Or so he say Islam, political Islam or political party based on Islam is not. So this is the tradition or cultural political tradition where I grew up with and sustain it and believe in it. So I have a deep suspicion toward Islamic Party. After the collapse of Suharto in 1998, and then the wave of democratization was raging in the country, we see the thriving and mushrooming of the political party based on Islamic ideology. from different spectrum, from far left to far right. So we have PKB or PAN in one hand, and then we have Partai Bulan Bintang or PBB, PKS, and others who are, propagating for the Islamist agendas. So I used to be very skeptical about the role played by the Islamist or Islamic political party. But now, especially after I spent 5 years away from the country and enjoying a very, the luxury of libraries, books, and spare time in Boston, and reflects, I comes to some kind of wise conclusion that I think we, the liberal or progressive Muslim activists in Indonesia, lost sight of the positive aspect of the democratization in Indonesia. In my presentation, in my paper, I referred to what I call as Faridian dilemma, referring to Farid Zakaria, who authored The Future of Freedom a few years ago. Farid Zakaria said that in authoritarian context, in authoritarian political context, if you open the gate for democracy or democratization, you run the risk of allowing the Islamist party to come into political arena and bring in illiberal agenda. So if you democratize authoritarian polity, the end result that you have is illiberalization of the society, not liberalization. I'm not in full agreement with this conclusion, even though this is a very smart observation. It's true partly, I think, but the case of the Indonesian experience, demonstrated that the opening of democracy in an authoritarian polity, Indonesia was or used to be a very autocratic polity. The opening of democracy in such context does not necessarily entail bringing in illiberal agendas. Of course, you have people like Islamic groups that propagate illiberal agenda, but in other side, you have a process of democratization in which it's opened up a space for all political parties, including the Islamic parties, to come into the arena and then negotiate. And I would like to end my presentation by quoting a very important case or development that I mentioned yesterday in the meeting with the graduate student here, that last year, a few months ago, PKS, or Justice Political Party, which is very much inspired by the ideology of Ikhwanul Muslimin in Egypt. This party, a few months ago, launched a new campaign to promote pluralism. And this campaign cannot be, the importance of the campaign cannot be understood without looking into the background in the landscape of Indonesian Islam. Because 2 or 3 years ago, in 2005, the Council of Ulama of Indonesia issued a fatwa that said that pluralism is an Islamic idea. It's contrary to the faith of Islam, because pluralism can lead Muslim into believing that all religions are the same. That contradicts the belief of the Muslim that Islam is the only truth. It's contradicts the claim of the Islamic uniqueness. So that's why pluralism is anathemized. So PKS, a political party which is inspired by Ikhwanul Muslimin, by the ideology of Sayyid Qutb, of people like Fathi Yakan and Mustafa Mashhur and others in Egypt, this party, out of the blue, just make a statement which surprised everybody in Indonesia. That pluralism is something that should be promoted. And the statement was made in Bali. And Bali is, in Indonesian talents. It's called as the island of god and goddesses, Pulau Dewata, meaning non-Islamic or let's say fake or false gods, the island of false god. But Bali is representing the residue of pre-Islamic era in Indonesia. So for me, it's very symbolic that PKS made such bold move. So for me, I mean, this process of democratization in Indonesia brings in some, moderation to that moderate the extreme edge of many ideologies brought by Muslim or Islamic political party. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is step back from the three presentations and say, as I'm sitting and listening, it seems to me that I hear 2 or 3 underlying themes that may not have been explicitly put forward, but I think are very important in the lines of analysis. The first one is simple, and I think Chaiwat really kind of set it forward to us, but he didn't sort of make it into a grand theory, and I teach world history, so I'll make it into a grand theory. At the beginning of the 21st century, if we are going to understand what's going on any place in the world, whether it's Washington, D.C. Or Southeast Asia, we have to recognize, I think, that the terminology for analysis of sociocultural, religious, and political developments that may have been appropriate in the 20th century no longer fit what most of us are studying. Now, there is a marvelous ethno-linguist, or I'm not sure what that, what is Lakoff's formal field? But it's not just linguistics. I mean, ethno-linguistics. He has this marvelous book, essentially political, thinking about politics, and the subtitle is Why You Can't Understand 21st Century American Politics with an 18th Century Mind. And what I would like to argue is we also need to all be aware that we are dealing with a yet unwritten text that I think lies behind the three presentations that says you can't understand 21st century Southeast Asia with a 20th century mind. And let me just, we can start with autonomy, that the old style, territorial-based, Abrahamic traditions of thinking about autonomy need to be expanded if we're going to understand issues not just of Patani, but of the broader issues of where do the sub-regions that are culturally identified more than territorially identified all around the world, where do they fit in? The kind of issues that Chaiwat is raising are, God willing, the new American administration is going to be trying to maybe help persuade them, persuade the Chinese that even this kind of analysis might fit dealing with Buddhists in Tibet. So we've got, first thing then, autonomy and rethinking things like autonomy and self-governance, because basically, when we're talking about autonomy, whether it's Mindanao or whether it is the various sub-regions in Indonesia or in Malaysia or in Thailand, we are thinking in terms that are defined by the political science. No offense to the political scientists. We are thinking in terms that the political scientists really succeeded in telling us that the basic unit of identity is the territorial sovereign nation state. And all of those words are important. And if you try and do what Chaiwat is doing of taking one of those pieces out, territory or unitary sovereignty or nation or state, if you try and take one of those out, it doesn't work. Well, it does work. It has to work, because the basic unit of identity is not necessarily the territorial sovereign nation state headed by Manila or Bangkok. That pluralism could be preached as a doctrine of Islam, in the same way that I could preach my Christian sermon about pluralism as a doctrine. Pluralism is not a convenient arrangement. That's toleration. Pluralism is a content. It says God made everybody different, and that's the way it should be. Now, if you think for a moment of what that means, what does that mean for dawah? What does that mean for Christian mission? If you try and make everybody member of the same community, aren't you going against God's word? And so on. So you have this kind of redefinition that I think, I'm sure that the PKS is not advocating giving up on dawah, but at the same time, I do think that we have a very interesting kind of new set of terminology that we're dealing with. And we're being reminded in all of this that some of the terms that we think we know the definition of don't fit. Key term, reminded in our last, but also as we look at autonomy, and also as we look at what the Bangsamoro people should be able to have. Democracy. If you really look at what democracy is, and of course now we've had the what do we call it, the evangelical democratism of the previous American administration that preached it as a doctrine. It was a very simplistic, complete definition that this wasn't advocacy of democracy. It was advocacy of a very, very particular and very, very specific mode of democracy that if it didn't fit a very tight template, it wouldn't work. It wasn't democracy. And so people like Fareed Zakaria are reminding us that democracy isn't by definition liberal. Democracy isn't by definition Western. Democracy is a mode of broad-based participation, and broad-based participation becomes a mode that can be very authoritarian and unquote undemocratic, and so that as we look then at illiberal democracy, we need to be reminded that inherent in modernization are two modes of democracy, and this is what Fareed and others are reminding us. Inherent in democracy are two modes of participation. One is the illiberal, majoritarian, authoritarian, Robespierre and the Jacobins. The tradition coming out of the French Revolution is not a liberal, let's recognize minority rights and all of that kind of democracy. So that listening to this, and I could sort of go on and on, because this is something that I find of crucial importance. But I think that as we look at the experiences of Southeast Asia that we've just heard these marvelous presentations on, I think that one of the things that the underlying theme is each one of them, in one way or another, was telling us we need to rethink not just the politics, not just the sort of the visual politics or the visual culture. We need to rethink the very concepts that we are using to try and understand what is going on, because the 21st century is a new era. Now then, what I would just like to do secondly, briefly, is in this, again, as I'm listening, what is a kind of an interesting common theme? The role of authoritarian central structure for societies. Now, I look around the room and I'm quite sure I am the oldest person in the room. I was probably in graduate school before most of you were even born. But so that I can say when I was in graduate school, there were certain sort of automatic truths I was in graduate school in the days when a really good seminar paper was on the role of the military in country X. The dominance of the role of the military. Why is military coup the most effective way of changing government? Middle East didn't have really any revolutions. It had sort of peaceful military coups and murderous military coups. It had Gamal Abdel Nasser and it had Abdul Karim Qasim and so on. In the 50s, in the 60s, military coup, whether it was Suharto or whether it was Gamal Abdel Nasser, all of these were the common mode of transition of government. And as I listened to the three presentations, oh how, quote, far we have come. Oh, how far we have come from the days when the first question you asked was, what is the loyalty of the military? You still have to ask it. But reformasi, all of the revolutions that overthrew the communist regime in Eastern Europe, all of these sorts of things mean that, again, the political and social and cultural and the dynamics of revolution have been transformed at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think that it is really useful and really important to have these three presentations, which represent both a very concrete examination of particular issues, but raising also very profound issues for analysis not just of Southeast Asian politics, but even of American politics. Thank you very much.